Buddy, can I get your attention, please? My name is Ken Hoffman. I'm one of the co-founders of the Campbell County Civil War Roundtable. And tonight, we're very fortunate to have Dr. Jim Ramage here. We've heard him talk before, so we're in for a treat. Every time we hear him, it's good. Every time I hear him, I learn something new. I first met him in Chicago several years ago at the Chicago Civil War Roundtable. So we're in for a treat tonight. So without further ado, I'll introduce our speaker, Dr. James Ramage.
Thank you, Ken. Did everybody get two maps?
Yeah.
One is the March of Lew Wallace Division in Shiloh, and the other one is the battle map from Dr. Rowland's book. Thank you, Will, for the invitation.
You're welcome.
I'm honored to speak for you tonight, and I want to thank Will for commending us in the tradition of our honorable founder, Larry Hennigan. And thank you all for attending. Bernie O'Brien, congratulations on your reenactment as General Lew Wallace in the Indiana University documentary.
Thank you.
The first scene, when Wallace is inspired to write Ben-Hur in a conversation on a train with the great American agnostic, is truly outstanding. It's just a beautiful, dramatic scene. The whole thing is. So I highly recommend it.
Thank you.
Bernie knows General Wallace, as he demonstrated when he spoke for us. And so I'm looking forward to having Bernie's help on answering your questions tonight on Lew Wallace. Chris Burns, thank you for your great lecture last month, and thank you for your help on Grant. Chris has been really helpful with my internet research on Grant's reputation, and in many ways sharing with me and discussing and encouraging me. So appreciate Chris very much. I want to thank Dan DiOrio for finding valuable information on Grant's habits and appearance and other details. My talks on John Hunt Morgan have taken me far and wide. In November 1987, I spoke on Morgan for the Chicago Civil War Roundtable. And it was a pleasant surprise to meet Ken Hoffman from Highland Heights in Chicago that evening. And I have been invited to the annual Wilbur Nye Richard Summers Lecture at the Harrisburg, Pennsylvania Civil War Roundtable in May. And I'll speak on Morgan. Their speaker for this annual lecture last year was James McPherson. And I feel deeply honored to follow James McPherson in the lecture series. My Mosby book has just been published by University Press Audio Books. You can hear a free sample on Amazon.com. You click on that little circle with the triangle in it, and you can hear my book being read, a segment of it, about 3 or 4 paragraphs. It was amazing yesterday to hear my writing read on the internet. They selected part of Chapter 12 on The Night Belongs to Mosby. So it sounded so good, I think I'll add it to my Mosby speech next time I give it. I didn't know I could write so well. They told me the reader, Gary Wilprecht, might contact me for help with pronunciations. And sure enough, he emailed me on how to pronounce my name. Is it French? He asked. I replied, no, it's Scottish. And students I had over 40 years ago still remember what I said the first day of class in every course. My name is Ramage. It rhymes with damage. And I hope that's not what happens to your grade point average in this class. I had jury duty last fall. I retired, and my first fall on retirement I was called for jury duty, which was pleasant. There are not many trials now with so many plea bargains, and I came close once, but I was not put on the jury. The story is told of a conscientious judge who decided to try a drunk driving case one afternoon at 4 p.m. The attorneys were ready and the defendant was ready, but the prospective jurors had been sent home. So the judge went through the courthouse and the offices across the street and rounded up 12 lawyers to serve on the jury. This was unheard of, but he said the trial will be brief, and they admired the judge and they agreed. The trial lasted 10 minutes, and the jury of 12 lawyers left to deliberate. About 3 hours later, they had not returned. and the judge sent the bailiff to check on them. When the bailiff returned, the judge said, "Well, have they got a verdict yet?" "Verdict," said the bailiff. "They're still doing nomination speeches for the foreman's position." The Battle of Shiloh was the first great battle of the Civil War and the largest battle on the continent at the time. It's one of the most misunderstood battles in the war. My freshman survey textbook repeats untruths widely accepted still today. The fighting raged for 2 days, from daylight to dark on Sunday, April 6, 1862, and from daylight to 4 p.m. on Monday. Grant reported that on the first day, the most continuous firing of musketry and artillery ever heard on this continent was kept up until nightfall. The men compared the sound to the roar of an approaching train or the crashing of trees falling before a mighty storm. One said it sounded like the growl of some wounded monster, furious and at bay. When it ended, the battlefield looked like a huge animal had been thrashing about. The earth was plowed with shot and shell. The dense undergrowth was clipped chest high, and trees were topped, limbs splintered and scattered on the ground. Late in the war, Grant and his wife Julia were in Washington, and Secretary of War Edwin Stanton gave them a tour of the War Department. Stanton showed them stands of captured arms and captured flags, and what impressed Julia the most was the stump of a large tree perforated on all sides by bullets taken from the field of Shiloh. Grant recalled, "I saw an open field in our possession on the second day, over which the Confederates had made repeated charges the day before, so covered with dead that it would have been possible to walk across the clearing in any direction, stepping on dead bodies without a foot touching the ground." Grant had captured Fort Henry and Fort Donelson, and he believed the Confederacy was on its last leg. He thought the Confederate Army was demoralized and on the defensive, building entrenchments at Corinth, Mississippi, 22 miles southwest of his camp at Pittsburgh Landing on the Tennessee River. Earlier in Missouri and Cairo, Illinois, Grant had employed and sent out scouts to spy on the enemy. Grant had dispelled the fog of war with military intelligence by the use of spies. But here, expecting to march south as soon as Buell arrived from Nashville, and believing that the enemy would not move from where they were, Grant sent out no scouts. He thought Beauregard was in command in Corinth and did not know that the best general on the continent, Albert Sidney Johnston, had arrived and was making the decisions. Pretty basic. Don't even know who the enemy commander is. Beauregard was second in command to Johnston. Grant maintained headquarters 9 miles down the river to the north at Savannah, Tennessee, on the other side of the river from the camp at Pittsburgh Landing. He visited the camp daily, but returned at night to Savannah to be on hand to welcome General Buell's army from Nashville and organize the transfer of Buell's men up the river. He placed Sherman in command at the camp. Department Commander Henry Halleck sent entrenchment tools, but Grant's men dug no field works. Sherman agreed with Grant that the Confederates would not attack. Sherman said it would damage the offensive spirit of his men to dig trenches. Meanwhile, in Corinth, General Johnston set out to march to Pittsburgh Landing and attack Grant's camp by surprise at daylight before Buell arrived. He said he would hit Grant and hit him hard. On Friday, April 4, 2 days before the battle, skirmishing broke out between Sherman's men and Confederate cavalry covering the rebel advance. Union Major Elbridge Ricker, 5th Ohio Cavalry, told Sherman the enemy was here with cavalry and infantry. Sherman, overcompensated for being declared insane for crying wolf in Kentucky, said, "Oh, tut, tut, you militia officers get scared too easily." A few men were wounded and killed on both sides, and Sherman's men captured 10 rebels. They were placed in Shiloh church for the night, and one said, "There are more graybacks in the woods than you've ever seen. And if you ain't mighty careful, they'll run you into hell or the river before tomorrow night." Grant learned about the fighting that day and came to investigate. He was riding to the front when he was informed that there was no danger. He rode back to the landing after dark in a thunderstorm. His horse slipped and fell on him, injuring his ankle. His boot had to be cut off, and he walked on crutches during the battle. The next morning, Saturday, April 5, the day before the battle, Confederate General Hardee's corps marched into line about 1 mile from Sherman's camp. Large numbers of squirrels and rabbits ran into the Union camp, and strange dogs came meandering into the tents. Skirmishing broke out in front of Colonel Jesse Appler, 53rd Ohio Volunteers, and he sent his quartermaster to tell Sherman. Sherman said, "Tell Colonel Appler to take his regiment to Ohio. There is no enemy nearer than Corinth." Late that afternoon, Beauregard on the Confederate side said Surprise was lost and the attack must be canceled. He believed surely the skirmishing had alerted the enemy, and when the rain stopped, it had rained all night, the men fired their weapons to reload with dry powder. They disobeyed the order to be quiet and cheered and shouted and beat drums and sounded bugles. Johnston's reply to Beauregard and his commanders in the meeting they had was, "Gentlemen, we shall attack at daylight tomorrow." That Saturday night, Sherman reported to Grant that the skirmish was nothing but a cavalry demonstration. "I do not apprehend anything like an attack on our position," he wrote. Grant in turn reported to General Halleck in St. Louis, "I have scarcely the faintest idea of an attack, general one, being made upon us, but will be prepared should such a thing take place." Buell's advance brigade, coming from Nashville, under Colonel Jacob Ammen, had arrived in Savannah, where Grant's headquarters were, and Ammen offered to march toward Pittsburgh Landing immediately. Grant said, "There is no urgency," that Ammen should wait for boats on Monday or Tuesday. Quote, "There will be no fight at Pittsburgh Landing," Grant said. We will have to go to Corinth where the rebels are fortified." The result, wrote Charles Rowland in his biography of Johnston, was, quote, "one of the greatest strategic surprises in all military history," end of quote. On the strategic level, it was a total surprise. Grant and his generals did not expect an attack in force. They had no idea that the Army of the Mississippi was within 1 mile of their camps. But tactically, on the field, it was not a surprise. Sherman ordered the officers on Saturday on the front to post extra pickets and be cautious. Colonel Everett Peabody, commander of a brigade in General Benjamin Prentice's division on the front to Sherman's left, obeyed. Peabody was 31 years old, a railroad engineer from Missouri and a Harvard graduate. He was 6 feet 1 inch tall and weighed 240 pounds. He knew the enemy was in force in the woods, and he told his general, General Prentice, who laughed. Peabody told his men that he had a presentiment that he would be killed the next day. Unable to sleep, he sent out a small patrol, and they encountered enemy pickets. Therefore, at 3 a.m., he organized a force of 5 infantry companies, and standing beside an old wagon road leading through the woods, he sent them forward. But first he said goodbye and said that he would be killed today. The sky was clear and the night was cool, and the patrol formed a skirmish line with the right extending into John Fraley's 40-acre cotton field. They waited for daylight. At first light, they saw on the other side of the field enemy soldiers kneeling in a picket line. Major James Powell, their commander, ordered them forward, and they attacked Confederate General Hardee's pickets from Mississippi. The Battle of Shiloh began at 4:55 a.m., not with a Confederate surprise attack, but with a Union attack. The fight lasted for about an hour, and Sherman and Prentiss heard the firing and ordered their men into line. By 7 a.m., Sherman's division was under arms, ready to fight, and the Confederate cannon fired their first shots at 7:10 a.m. But the Confederate infantry did not attack until 8 a.m. I saw the glistening bayonets of heavy masses of infantry on our left front in the woods, Sherman recalled. By then, Sherman had 3 hours to prepare. The Mississippi skirmishers in the cotton field were awake and on duty before daylight that morning, but the Confederate army was asleep. They awakened at the sound of the fight, and it took them an hour to eat breakfast and form in line. Their advance was through rugged terrain, and the delay until 8 a.m. meant the attack was not a tactical surprise. When the attack came, some of the men in regiments on Sherman's left and Prentiss's right ran for the rear. This was their first battle, and their officers were inexperienced. Colonel Appler's regiment repelled 2 charges, but when the rebels formed and came again, Colonel Appler decided it was time to take Sherman's advice and head toward Ohio. He shouted, "Retreat, boys, and save yourselves." He led them in running away, and some of his men ran. Others remained in the fight and fought bravely from his regiment. Colonel Peabody was attempting to rally stragglers when he was struck in the hand, thigh, neck, and abdomen. Still on his horse and pleading with his men, he was struck with a 5th bullet in the head, and he fell dead. A braver or more noble man never lived, one of his men wrote. Grant was having breakfast with his staff 9 miles away when he heard the booming of cannon at 7:10 a.m. He stood up and said, "Gentlemen, the ball is in motion. Let's be off." He had a note written to General William Nelson, commander of the first of Buell's divisions that had arrived, and ordered him to move south along the east bank of the river. He wrote Buell, "Heavy firing is heard up the river, indicating plainly that an attack has been made upon our most advanced positions." On the way up the river, Grant's headquarters steamboat Tigris whistled and drew into Crump's Landing, about 6 miles north of Pittsburgh Landing. There his division commander, General Lew Wallace, was posted with about 5,000 men guarding against an attack from Confederates in Purdy to the west. Wallace was on the deck of his headquarters steamboat watching for Grant. Crewmen latched the boats together, and Grant leaned over the rail and said, "Have you heard the firing?" "Yes, sir, since daybreak." "What do you think of it?" "It's undoubtedly a general engagement." Wallace expected Grant to order him to march toward Pittsburgh Landing immediately. But Grant said, "Well, hold yourselves in readiness to march upon orders received." Wallace said he was ready now, and Grant repeated that he should wait for orders. Grant wanted to get to Pittsburgh Landing and confirm that Wallace was needed there, that it wasn't just a feint, but the real attack was at Pittsburgh Landing. And in the meantime, he wanted Wallace to stay where he was, guarding against a possible attack from Purdy. Arriving at Pittsburgh Landing about 8:30 a.m., Grant sent ammunition wagons and several regiments to the front, and he sent his quartermaster, Captain A.S. Baxter, to Crump's Landing to order Lew Wallace forward. By the time Grant reached the front to visit his division commanders, the front line had fallen back from their camps. He appeared cool and confident, smoking a cigar and looking no more excited than when on a routine inspection. His great contribution that day was that he refused to act as though he was losing. He focused on the goal of surviving until nightfall. "Delay counts for everything with us," he told an aide. "Tomorrow we will attack with fresh troops and drive them." He persuaded some of the stragglers to return to the fight, but most refused. "We are whipped, cut to pieces," one said. Another screamed that it was Bull Run all over again. The rebel army was huge and would drive them into the river. Another stood by the road yelling to troops marching forward, "For God's sake, don't go out there. You will all be killed. Come back, come back." A tale claimed that when Grant asked one man, "What are you running for?" the man replied, "Because I can't fly." In contrast, what he saw when he came to Sherman and his men in the hottest of the fight encouraged and strengthened Grant. Sherman's horse had been killed, and a bullet had passed through his right palm, and he had wrapped it in a handkerchief and thrust it inside his jacket. During the battle at Fort Donelson, Grant had left Sherman in Paducah because he was still recovering from his nervous breakdown in Kentucky. Now, Grant saw Sherman in battle and realized that he was looking at his second self. Sherman had found himself. He was as calm as Grant, totally in control. Now, as they observed each other in this moment of heavy battle, there was forged a trust, a friendship, and admiration that was to endure as long as both lived, wrote historian Kenneth P. Williams. Sherman wrote about their conversation in a letter a few years later. After some general conversation, he remarked that I was doing right in stubbornly opposing the progress of the enemy. And in answer to my inquiry as to cartridges, he told me he had anticipated their want and given orders accordingly. He then said his presence was more needed over at the left. Grant wrote later, "I never deemed it important to stay long with Sherman." One of Grant's aides recalled that all day he continuously rode along the line of battle through the hottest of fire for the whole distance of 5 miles. At one point, a canister shot from artillery struck the scabbard of his sword and bent it. He told his officers and men in the ranks that General Wallace and General Buell were on the way. Just hold the line until they arrived. By 11 a.m., Grant's 6 frontline brigade camps had been captured, and the Union Army formed a new line running through the area of the Hornet's Nest. Grant ordered a company of 2nd Illinois Cavalry to ride as fast as possible to Wallace and tell him to come immediately. He wrote a note to General Nelson marching south on the other side of the river. And this note shows how concerned Grant was at that point in midday, between 11 and 12. "The attack on my forces has been very spirited from early this morning. The appearance of fresh troops on the field now would have a powerful effect, both by inspiring our men and disheartening the enemy. If you will get up on the field leaving all your baggage on the east bank of the river, it will be a move to our advantage and possibly save the day for us. The rebel force is estimated at over 100,000 men." Grant did not usually overestimate the enemy's strength, but this time he was estimating it over twice its size. They had about 40,000, and he told Nelson that it was 100,000. It shows how desperately he needed Lew Wallace. Where was Lew Wallace? When Grant sent oral orders by Captain Baxter, he meant to order Wallace to come on the shortest route, 6 miles on River Road. But it's careless, unusually careless for Grant to send an oral order. You don't know what it's going to end up being once it gets there. So you need to write it out. But Grant was overstressed, and he sent an oral order with Baxter earlier that morning. Wallace understood when he received the oral order that he was to come in on the right flank of the army. This made sense to Wallace because he had repaired the shunpike that connected him to possible reinforcements on the right of the enemy of the U.S. Army camp at Pittsburgh Landing. So when Captain Baxter met Wallace at 11:30 a.m., Wallace, assuming that he's to go to the right, not that he's to head sort of to his left and stay along the river, but go to the right on the shunpike that he built up. Wallace had concentrated his division at Stony Lonesome, about 3 miles west of Crump's Landing. He gave 30 minutes for lunch, and about noon he was marching on the shunpike, or marching toward it, when the 2nd Illinois Cavalry appeared with orders to rush. Between noon and 1 p.m., Grant ordered his aide, Captain W.R. Rowley, to ride to Wallace and tell him to bring his division up at once, coming up by the river road. Rowley reached Wallace at about 2 p.m. on the shunpike, only about 2.5 miles from the battlefield. And that's one thing that's so frustrating about this for Wallace. He was almost there at 2 o'clock. Almost there. He gave Wallace the order and excitedly reported that the Union battle line has fallen back. He said, listen, can't you hear it? It's fallen back. We've fallen back. And if you were to go down the shunpike and come in on what used to be the right of the Union Army, you'd be behind the Confederate Army and you'd be captured. You'd be in great danger. So Wallace realized that he had to turn back on the shunpike and backtrack. So Wallace ordered a countermarch to put his 1st regiment that he wanted to lead him into battle back to the front. So they countermarched back through his division. And he backtracked along the shunpike for nearly 4 miles to an improved farm lane, or unimproved farm lane. It's just a dirt path that connected with River Road. At 2:30 p.m., Grant took action that demonstrates how frustrated he was. He ordered 2 of his most trusted staff members to ride to Crump's Landing and bring Wallace's division. Colonel James B. McPherson, his engineer, and Captain John A. Rawlings, his adjutant, rode like the wind all along River Road and then down the shunpike, where they found Wallace's men turning into the farm lane at about 3:30 or 4, and they urged him to hurry. Wallace had not told Grant or his staff about rebuilding the shunpike or about considering it to be the connecting road to the Army. So Grant's staff said that Wallace had been lost. He was never lost, but having to double back meant that he did not arrive until nearly dark, after the firing had ended. Grant saw Wallace entering the battlefield. There was no longer a battle going on, and shouted, "Now we are all right, all right." There's Wallace. If Wallace had taken the river road, he could have marched the 6 miles in about 2.5 hours and arrived at about 2:30 p.m. The route he covered was not 6 miles, but 16.75 miles, and it took him 7 hours. Gale Stevens, author of the book Shadow of Shiloh, and a group of park rangers walked the route in 2005, the route that Wallace took that day, and it took them 7 hours and 15 minutes. 15 minutes longer than Lew Wallace. This demonstrates that when Grant's staff accused Wallace later of marching slow, he was not going slow. Not at all. But he just was going a long way to go there and back. At about 2:30 p.m., about the time that Confederate General Johnston was killed leading a charge, Grant ordered his chief of staff, Colonel Joseph Webster, to deploy a defensive line of artillery on the ridge near the landing. Webster brought from a steamboat 5 huge 24-pound siege guns from the river, where they were meant for a siege of Corinth. And when cannon crews fell back, Webster included them in line until he had a line of about 50 cannon, extending 1/2 mile from the river. So by the time General Benjamin Prentiss surrendered at the Hornet's Nest about 5:30, Grant had a strong defensive line of artillery and infantry. The Confederates tested it with one last charge and were repulsed. General Beauregard called a halt to the fighting and wired Richmond that he'd gained a complete victory, driving the enemy from every position. Shelby Foote wrote that Robert E. Lee whipped Grant in the Battle of the Wilderness if Grant would only admit it by retreating, which in turn was only a way of saying that he had not been whipped at all, because Grant did not retreat from the wilderness. At Shiloh, a lesser general would have retreated or remained on the defensive the next morning. If Grant had remained on the defensive the next day, he would not have had a clear victory, and his career would probably have ended. Grant had lost over 7,000 men killed and wounded, and his army was disorganized and confused. Courage in a Civil War battle required organization. And you needed a man to have on his left and right somebody that he knows, for him to march out there into that wall of bullets, for his courage to operate, and for the whole thing to operate. You need organization. And there was confusion, and the units were mixed up. They weren't where they're supposed to be. And so there was much confusion in the line that night as darkness came. And there were over 5,000 stragglers milling around on the riverbank wanting to go home. Colonel James McPherson escorted Lew Wallace's division onto the field, onto their place in the line on the right, and he rode back down the line to Grant and said, "General Grant, under this condition of affairs, what do you propose to do? Shall I make preparations for retreat?" Grant answered, "Retreat? No. I propose to attack at daylight and whip them." He visited the division commanders after dark and ordered them to attack with a strong skirmish line as soon as it was light, and follow with their entire command, leaving no reserves. It started raining, and Grant spent the night under a large oak tree near his headquarters cabin. General Sherman understood the orders to attack at daylight, but his division was so disorganized it seemed impossible. His hand was hurting, and he revealed in an 1893 interview that he lost his self-confidence. After that terrible Sunday at Shiloh, he said, "I started out to find Grant and see how we were to get across the river. It was pouring rain and pitch dark. There was considerable confusion, and the only thing just then possible, as it seemed to me, was to put the river between us and the enemy and recuperate." He found Grant standing under his tree, rain dripping off the brim of his hat, a lantern in his hand, and puffing on a cigar. In Grant's presence, Sherman could not suggest retreat. He said, "Well, Grant, we've had the devil's own day, haven't we?" "Yes, lick 'em tomorrow, though," said Grant. Grant's determination was demonstrated all night by the shelling of the enemy line by his gunboats, Tyler and Lexington. Every 10 or 15 minutes, there was a loud boom on the river, followed by the scream of a shell and a red streak in the sky from the burning fuse and the blast of the exploding shell. Grant was sending the message that he was not defeated. The night after Cold Harbor, he ordered General Meade to keep Lee and his men awake all night with such shelling, but Meade convinced him to withdraw the order. Meade said, "It'll keep our men awake too. Just let our men sleep." Grant wasn't worried about sleep. He wanted to give Lee the message, I'm not defeated here. You didn't defeat me today. The next day, Grant outnumbered Beauregard about 2-1. With Buell having come up, Buell's men. Buell arrived by 1 o'clock, but his men arrived, some of them still arriving the next day at mid-morning. But many had arrived by sunrise. The Confederates fought bravely, but Grant's men drove them back across the field, and at 4 p.m. Beauregard retreated to Corinth. In the news, the first account of the battle appeared in the New York Herald on April 10, 3 days after the battle. W.C. Carroll took a steamboat to Fort Henry and filed it by telegraph. He wrote that it was a great victory, and Grant heroically rode along the lines in the thickest of the fire both days. The article did not mention the surprise. Newspapers all over the North reprinted Carroll's dispatch, and with the headline, Great Victory, celebrated that the hero of Fort Donelson had won again. Both houses of Congress read Carroll's dispatch, and Secretary of War Stanton ordered a 100-gun salute at the Washington Arsenal. Lincoln declared the next Sunday a day of thanksgiving and prayer for Shiloh and for the capture of Island Number 10 on the same day over on the Mississippi River as the second day at Shiloh. Then, Whitelaw Reid, a young correspondent for the Cincinnati Gazette, dropped a bomb. Reid was at Crump's Landing that Sunday morning, and when Grant's boat stopped, he jumped on board and arrived at Pittsburgh Landing with Grant. But when Reid arrived, rather than going with Grant toward the battle, he saw the stragglers stumbling toward the riverbank and recognized the scoop, and he followed them and started writing their words on his pad. He and other reporters interviewed the demoralized men for 2 days. Attempting to explain their desertion, the men told wild, untrue tales about how they were surprised. Reid knew his story would make a huge splash, and he came home to Cincinnati to write it. It was immediately reprinted throughout the North, and the people took Reid's account to heart. A historian described it as a masterpiece, engaging, carefully organized, filled with penetrating detail. Fresh from the field of the great battle, he began with its pounding and roaring of artillery and its keener voiced rattle of musketry still sounding in my wearied ears. And then he described how Grant's frontline officers and men were surprised and bayoneted or shot in their beds before they had time to take up arms. He wrote that Grant arrived late after disaster had struck, and he wrote that there was no evidence that Grant had led his troops during the 2 days of battle. The army was on its own. And then people back home in the Midwest, especially Ohio, read in their local newspapers reprints of articles from Chicago and other cities that described how their state's volunteers had deserted and ran to the landing. They said to themselves, our brave boys would not run unless they had a reason. And their editors and politicians gave them a scapegoat, U.S. Grant. Since Shiloh was the first large battle, everyone was shocked at the casualties. No one was more shocked than the surgeons on the scene in the battle. Over 3,400 men were killed, total on both sides, and the Union had over 8,500 wounded, and the Confederacy over 8,000 wounded. When Beauregard withdrew, he left about 1,000 wounded behind, and the Union surgeons had to treat over 9,500 wounded men and send them on steamboats up into the Midwest, into Mississippi River and Ohio River towns. People were shocked to learn that the war would not be quick, and it would not be relatively bloodless. This was the first large battle in history with the new mini ball and rifle muskets that spun the bullet and gave it greater killing power. When the mini ball struck bone, it shattered the bone, meaning that limb had to be amputated. Then the metal flattened and spinned, leaving a much larger hole where it came out than where it entered. The surgeons at Shiloh on both sides were very conservative with amputation, but the mini ball shattered bones, and amputation was the only choice. Lists of the names of the dead and wounded appeared in the newspapers, and people throughout the Midwest were moved to help the wounded. The Sanitary Commission, forerunner of today's Red Cross, chartered boats and sent supplies. State and city governments hired boats and staffed them with surgeons and nurses, volunteers. During the week after the battle, as many as 20 boats were at Pittsburgh Landing, taking on Union and Confederate wounded. Normally, when a steamboat landed in Covington and other river towns, word spread and a crowd gathered, and there was laughter and shouting as people greeted friends and family. You could hear the sound of happy voices 2 blocks away. But now, when a steamboat with Shiloh wounded arrived, word spread and a huge crowd gathered, and in silence and in tears watched as wounded men were carried on litters down the gangplank. Other people not at the public landing watched the procession through the streets to the military hospital. Bloody Shiloh, people named it, and they blamed the blood on Grant. Newspapers throughout the North blamed Grant for the surprise and reported him drunk. Additional reports quoted the stragglers, and Grant was accused of slaughtering his men. Sherman wrote that the stragglers told, quote, tales of horrid surprise, regiments all cut up, they the only survivors, and to our utter amazement, we find it settling down as history. He wrote his brother, Senator John Sherman, not a man was bayoneted in his tent. Indeed, our brigade surgeon Hartshorn has not yet seen a single bayonet wound on a living or dead subject. The Cincinnati Commercial said Grant read and approved Carroll's romantic, heroic story in the New York Herald and manufactured himself into a newspaper hero. Some editors accused him of throwing the battle to extend the war. Grant wrote a letter to his father Jesse stating there was no surprise, that, quote, nothing could be more false, end of quote, and the letter condemned the tales of the stragglers, and without his son's approval, Jesse released the letter to the press, and it was widely printed. Now they accused the general of covering up the surprise, degrading his soldiers, and violating the public convictions. Even newspapers that usually supported him demanded his removal. The St. Louis Democrat was his favorite paper. He bought a subscription for Julia. The paper declared Grant guilty of criminal neglect and that his army was surprised and slaughtered. The Louisville Journal had always been very supportive of Grant, but George Prentice now ridiculed Grant with one of his famous quips. No matter how many reports General Grant may make, we fear there can be no doubt that he was killed in the Battle of Pittsburgh Landing. And as far as the newspapers editors were concerned, Grant was a dead duck. He was dead. He would never be able to command again, according to them. The newspapers reported that rumors were circulating in Cincinnati and in the Army at Pittsburgh Landing that Grant was under arrest. So public opinion already had him under arrest. In an 1868 presidential campaign biography, Benjamin Losing wrote, "A wave of calumny and detraction swept over General Grant with a power that would have overwhelmed any man of less strength and courage." His father Jesse spoke at a rally at the Union Armory in Covington, and we don't know what he said, but we know what he wrote in a letter to Ohio Governor David Todd. The governor declared that the Ohio soldiers were not cowards. They only ran because of the criminal negligence of their generals. And Governor Todd sent Lieutenant Governor Benjamin Stanton to Pittsburgh Landing to interview the men. And Stanton published a report that said that Grant was stupid and negligent and he, quote, ought to be court-martialed or shot, end quote. Jesse wrote Governor Todd a lengthy emotional letter that described his son's brave leadership, even though he had to be lifted onto his horse because of his ankle injury acquired when he was on duty checking on his men before the battle. And Jesse closed, "And this is the general your subaltern would have shot while he would justify the 5,000 skedaddlers? Shame on such a demagogue." In Congress, the feeling against Grant was strong. Iowa Senator James Harlan said he saw a pattern. Grant lost at Belmont, and until the Navy saved him. He lost at Fort Donelson until General Charles Smith saved him. And he lost at Shiloh until General Don Carlos Buell saved him. With such a record, those who continue General Grant in active command will, in my opinion, carry on their skirts the blood of thousands of slaughtered countrymen. Grant wrote Julia that eventually attention would shift to the brave Union fight on the first day. He wrote, "The papers will get done with this thing after a while and look upon the first day's fight at Pittsburgh Landing as one of the best resistances ever made. The enemy outnumbered us 3-1 that day, and we held the field." Grant's friend in Congress, Elihu Washburn from Galena, Illinois, delivered a great speech in the House defending Grant. And he adroitly stressed the same thing. He said, "No matter whether there was a surprise or not, the manner in which our gallant troops fought on that day has conferred on them and upon the country imperishable renown." I like how he condemned the newspaper men. He declared, "Falsehood will travel from Maine to Georgia while truth is putting on its boots." It's the way it is today with social media. Falsehood travels from Maine to Georgia while truth is still putting on its shoes. His speech was printed and 1,000 copies sent to distribution to Grant's army. Julia and the children were staying with Jesse and Hannah and family in Covington. And it bothered Grant that they and their neighbors read the Cincinnati newspapers. Cincinnati was the center of reporting on the war in the Midwest. And Cincinnati was the center of the attack on Grant. He wrote, this was to Congressman Washburn, "To say that I have not been distressed at these attacks upon me would be false. For I have a father, mother, wife, and children who read them and are distressed by them, and I necessarily share with them in it." Julia wrote in her memoirs that she read a newspaper article stating that Grant did not show up at all on the first day, that he was at a dance house. "The idea," she wrote, "Dear Eunice, so earnest and serious. He never went to a party of any kind except to take me. As I sat reading this article from the papers, I felt too deeply wounded to weep. I felt hard and revengeful." When Washburn sent her a copy of his speech, she wrote a letter thanking him for exonerating her husband from the malicious and unfounded slanders of the press. Lincoln responded to the clamor by having Secretary of War Stanton Wright Halleck, who is now in command at Pittsburgh Landing, Department Commander now on the scene. "The President desires to know whether any neglect or misconduct of General Grant or any other officer contributed to the sad casualties that befell our forces on Sunday." In other words, Stanton wrote, was there a surprise? Was there neglect? Halleck arrived at Shiloh on April 11, 4 days after the battle. And he said immediately the talk of surprise was nonsense. And he answered Stanton in what was probably the best telegram that Stanton ever wrote. He pointed out that there was an enemy army on the field. That's what they forgot. Why isn't the blood result from the enemy? It's Grant. There's no enemy. It's just Grant. He's responsible. He gave 2 reasons for the casualties. Some officers, he wrote, were utterly unfit for their places, and the enemy army was numerous and brave. A great battle cannot be fought or a victory gained without many casualties, he declared. Grant was so relieved when Halleck arrived and when he realized that Halleck was not going to accuse him of being attacked by surprise. And Grant, at this point, everybody agrees, was the low point of Grant's public reputation in the war. and Halleck could have removed him. If he had sent a different message to Stanton and Lincoln, Grant would have been out of there. But Halleck saved Grant by his response. Late one night, Republican Congressman A.K. McClure called at the White House and summarized the charges against Grant, including that he was a drunk. And Lincoln looked him in the eye and said, "I can't spare this man. He fights." Shiloh was a great Union victory. The South's best opportunity to take the upper Mississippi Valley had faded. The South never smiled again after Shiloh, wrote New Orleans writer George Washington Cable. I'll close by quoting from my freshman textbook, and please don't believe it. The Confederates struck suddenly at Shiloh, a log church in the center of the Union camp. There, amid flowering dogwoods, peach trees, and honeysuckle, they found most of Grant's troops still sleeping or groggily eating breakfast. Some died in their bedrolls. After a day of bloody carnage and confusion, Grant's men were pinned against the river. Thank you very much. I don't have this. Lincoln's Gamble, Todd
For you
Brewster.
for coming to talk to us. And before you leave, there's a couple quick announcements here. One is next month, which will be our last month of this year for our meeting here. I've talked to Bernie O'Brien, General Wallace. I'm going to try to get, if his schedule will fit into it, we will have General Wallace here next month. And the other thing is, our other little agency there, the Campbell County Historical Society, has Dr. Tolsman, Donald Tolsman, who has spoken to us before. We'll talk about the history of the civic center.